Hello and welcome back. This is James as always. Before I mention absolutely anything, take a moment to look upon the transcendentally legendary genre-defining masterpiece and seminal work of MKW that is the track currently on your screen, Flowery Greenhouse. You may immediately be wondering, though, how I managed to play it in Season 13 of Lounge, considering the fact that it was removed from CTGP almost 2 years ago. The answer is that this is my fourth time in 8 episodes uploading an unorthodox event, this one being from the first set of so-called legacy squad queues in CT Lounge, which use a 32-track My Stuff pack that exclusively comprises tracks that are no longer in CTGP. I have to say that it's proven itself to have been an incredible idea. I've caught as many of them as I could thus far, and they've all been perfectly nostalgic experiences, so I must thank CT Lounge staff for being so open to the idea. There was even a 2v2 tournament hosted on this first iteration of the Legacy list, but my POV of the finals room was quite underwhelming, and more importantly, we didn't play this track. The funny thing is that when I first decided I was eventually going to make this series in mid-2023, this track had just been removed. And I can't quite recall exactly, but I imagine that the sequence of events, the account of which I'll spare no detail of in this video, leading up to its removal were, in all likelihood, one of the motivating factors as to why I wanted to recount my experiences on CTs in a commentated series like this. Something I didn't initially realize about the entries in this series so far is that I've actually expressed them within far more of a sociologically oriented frame than I believed I was going to when first consolidating the ideas that went into them. This topic, which I really wanted to establish the series first before presenting, was intended to be the first episode since the first episode to take a categorically sociological and kind of genealogical, at least on a small scale, form. But in truth, I've already been doing that, which ultimately means this will be less so out of left field than it would have otherwise been. So perhaps my over-socialized approach to previous commentaries will have made this video more approachable, considering that this is a topic I'm doing entirely for my own sake so as to get it off my chest. With that out of the way, I'd like to announce the first episode of a new sub-series starting now that I'm calling Still Mad About, so as to refer to my own inability to let any relatively insignificant past events go. The general idea is that I'll use the narrative and cultural backstory behind a given CTGP track to illustrate sociological trends within the community that I dislike, but with an overarching focus on the communal background that these trends spawned from. It's one thing to remain bitter about MKW CT drama, but the real point of this reflection is to try to elucidate what went wrong, quote unquote, in order to provide the context to anyone who may be interested of these broad social trends, so as to facilitate a greater sense of awareness of these former missteps, not for the pathetically pedagogical sake of avoiding these terrible mistakes in the future, but rather just to serve as a historical example brought to life, indicative of what direction the community ended up heading into off the back of what it used to represent. And for today's psychohistory lesson, reference to the Foundation series of novels by Isaac Asimov, that means covering the story of multiple servers in the competitive CT sphere over the course of 2022 to 2023, as they unwittingly gave rise to the single most successful targeted removal campaign in CTGP history. But before any of that can make sense, I must first discuss the track meta of the past. If you didn't understand what I was getting at when I said this would be a venture into sociology and genealogy, then you will shortly. And for once in one of these chronology segments, I actually won't be starting with the early 2020s. However, I'm deliberately going to keep my commentary on this topic to a general overview because I'd like to make this into its own video in the future. That is, the relationship between the competitive meta and the most difficult tracks in the pack at a given time. It might seem like I'm unnecessarily elaborating here, but I really do think that I'll both still have enough material to cover this topic on its own at some point without being too redundant, and that for you to understand my thoughts on the matter at hand, I'm really required to try to relate the spirit of the times to a hypothetically completely unaware party. But for the moment, I now need to coin the obligatory new phrase for the video. I know I'm doing it pretty early on this time. Today's term is difficulty core, which I technically already made mention of in episode 3, but I actually seek to provide a definition here. I use the term to describe the set of tracks within the early 1.03 era of CTGP that are specifically track knowledge reliant and which also tended to require an understanding of quote-unquote jank physics within the game. I like this definition because it incorporates both models that flatly break all modern design principles like District 65, as well as something more moderate but still exemplary of the concept like Candy Mountains. Most would simply refer to the purview of what I'm calling difficulty core tracks as hard tracks, but that would be to overlook an indispensable part of the difficulty core phenomenon. What an individual player will consider a hard track is specific to that player, and will really only end up revealing what kind of background they're hailing from with regards to their track taste. The skill you possess or don't possess at a certain set of tracks is a considerably precursory factor to what you and your clanmates will naturally prefer and what's in vogue for the meta at a certain place and time, because those are the tracks you'll be playing, practicing, and getting used to. You could perceive a set of tracks as hard that others find quite easy. What's considered hard to play is really only in the eye of the beholder, with the exception of tracks that are intrinsically difficult, tracks whose difficulty is an inexorable part of the design. As time goes on, of course, what tracks may be considered difficulty core as warped as a result of collective skill increasing and distinctively stratifying upwards when compared to the complacently, suffocatingly, kind of dragged down by mediocrity all-div era of Toilet Duck in the 2010s. Whereas Mansion of Madness terrified all of us low-rank Timbogs back then, and we'd all get cold feet when approaching the inconsistent zipper stick turn, the low to mid-div players of today don't even seem to have a subconscious apprehensiveness towards that kind of thing. Obviously it's been updated since then, but regardless. There's no need to worry about how the idea has evolved for the purposes of this topic, though, because the thread of thought that I'm tracing starts that far back, to an era of CTGP that circumstantially and fortuitously integrated both the bold new approach to high-quality tracks, as well as the competitive, conducive staples of old, an era that begins with mid to late 2017. One thing that I love about 2017 in particular is the fact that there is not a single avenue of attack so as to claim that good tracks were being removed. I'm sure everyone is aware of Thunder's ill-fated attempt at making a so-called 2018 pack, but even during 2018 I had already developed a select few grievances with the tracks getting removed, like Fire Palace, Rooster Island, Old Helado Mountain, the list goes on. I was still overjoyed with the state of the pack overall in 2018 as a result of the incredible additions, but 2017 to me will always represent the pinnacle of CTGP. In mid-2017, at the outset of what has enough merit to posthumously be recognized as the Snicky Revolution, despite the fact that that's yet another term I just made up, a daring new design was introduced to CTGP in the first track update in over a year and a half. The so-called update draught, a term which I in fact did not just define, but actually defined half a decade ago, which lasted from early 2016 to mid-2017, was at long last broken by something monumental, a set of additions comprising Crystal Plains, Cortex Castle, and Flowery Greenhouse. Something surprising I learned while preparing this video was that Flowery's addition actually predates Glimmer by a period of 3 weeks, and in that sense, Flowery was incredibly epical as a harbinger of that beneficial dichotomy of the late 2010s I just alluded to. Both the tracks in the pack that had classic design and low-fidelity visuals, as well as the new additions with groundbreaking design and high-fidelity visuals, both coincided to contribute to an unprecedented level of competitiveness. The reason why Flowery was so special is because it existed as a perfect microcosm of contemporary CT design, containing just enough classic CT skill diff jank like the first cannon entrance on the zipper section, as well as just enough of the skill-based driving and pervasive sense of techie outline encouraging strats to allow it to bridge the gap between the pre-update draught era and this shiny new era. But what does this have anything to do with difficulty core? Like I said, I'm not within this video scope to deliver a full dissertation on the subject, but Flowery does still need to be couched within the correct framework for this to make sense. So let's talk about the first of the two high div clans who carried the cultural torch by picking Flowery over the course of its time in the pack. Over the course of 2017, perhaps the most interesting CT clan to ever touch the game rose the rankings and worked their way up to D1. From CTWL seasons 9 through 11, a French clan rose from the depths of D3 obscurity, then to D2, and finally all the way to D1 playoff qualification over the course of just 1 year. You may have heard of them by many different names and tags, but they were known officially as Team Mech. What made Mech special wasn't just the fact that they were a national team. Something like that on CTs is less common in today's age, but was much more prevalent back then. Other clans like Carrigens and Anthelion were almost exclusively Italian and American respectively. I'm not sure if it's just me, but being grouped by nationality seems to have fallen by the wayside in terms of conventional league participating teams, thereby making World Cup much more distinct when compared to something like Team NDC versus Team France in 2016 World Cup, which featured groups of people who already play with each other regardless. But anyways, what made Mech special was their track pick methodology. In Season 9 of CTWL, they essentially spent the entire season griefing with tracks like GP Mario Beach, Red Loop, and even Baby Park. Most people probably wouldn't have found this to be an enriching or constructive experience, but that was somehow genuinely the case for them, because Mech would eventually end up refining their taste, with their accumulated proficiency in playing unorthodox designs helping them to find a middle ground between the unbalanced and archaic designs on the more primitive side of the pack, while also reconciling those crude track picks with the emerging wave of much more polished designs, new competitive conducive additions that was set in motion in 2017. They immediately began to experiment to find out what tracks from this forward-thinking era would be the most optimal for them. Once again, CTR Cortex, Cool Castle Canyon, Glimmer, Volcanic Valley, Unnerved Mushroom Island, all over the course of just 5 months in 2017 alone. And, of course, Flowery Greenhouse. Mech picked it extensively and seemed to really revel in the idea of trying to master all of its driving intricacies. Foster even has a video on his channel where he demonstrates the track's sort of anti-cannon dodge mechanism, that being the hilarious timing with which the pokies respawn after a cannon shot gets used. I'll link it below. It's worth noting specifically that after their track taste had suitably expanded, Mech's track picks didn't retain that same griefer ideology, at least not inherently. The intention instead was nothing more than to pick tracks that would utterly maximize the potential of picks to provide a competitive edge. For what it's worth, I think the community in the late 2010s had enough outright griefing on their plate to deal with when Glitch Squad parked their metaphorical tour bus outside of Lounge for half the year in 2019. There's a real disconnect at play knowing that new gens have never had to repress memories of seeing 8 out of the 12 people in an LU team picking the most physically carcinogenic luck-based shit ever put to a 3D modeling software. Still mad about them too. But not to get off track again, something else that needs to be mentioned about Mech, since it is crucial to understanding why any attempt today to replicate their success would be nothing more than a facsimile, is that they played the pack at by far the best time to maintain the approach to track picks that they did. Like I said, they eventually evolved from merely picking to grief to instead picking to foster, get it, the greatest atmosphere of competitiveness through the most knowledge-based and skill-diff-based designs. But those kinds of tracks were dated to an era that was soon to find itself on the way out. To put into perspective just how perfectly timed something like Season 12 of CTWL was for them, which took place in early 2018, both Marble Towers and Faraway Land were in the pack at the same time. Remember how I said that 2018's updates weren't perfect? Faraway Land, District 65, and even Citro's Wedding Altar, if you're a fan of that, all got wiped off the map within a single update in May of that year. But the tracks they were subsequently replaced with, Cave Island, Festival Town, and Big Express, were so universally beloved that the first traces of the end of the difficulty core era weren't remarked upon by anyone. I used to think that mech were ahead of their time, but I saw a YouTube comment a few months ago about a completely unrelated topic, which I've since forgotten about, that incidentally course-corrected my line of thought. Being the premier exemplification of the spirit of an era is not the same as being ahead of your time. It means instead that the group would exist as the highest ideal of that era. And that is the case here. Mech represents the highest form of competitiveness that could have been aspired to with relation to the ideal version of CTGP that existed alongside them for such a fleeting period of time. But why was it so fleeting? What caused the slow death of difficulty core? And how did Flowery get caught in the crossfire of this cultural warfare? The answer lies in the trend that I believe was inherent to the CT community's spanning campaign against Flowery Greenhouse and tracks like it, an increase in collective emphasis on track design criticism. As time continued to march onwards and the 2010s gave way to the 2020s, T-Mech quickly became just another relic of the past. I'm not sure if most players today even know of them, and in the absence of their frequent selection of Flowery, another D1 clan came along to pick up where they had left off. I have a little bit of familiarity with this team, it's RN, and the primary contributing factor as to how habitually we picked it in RN was, to be honest, because of me. I was bag maining in every league back then, and bagger clauses also didn't exist, so we didn't pick it in leagues at all, but it was commonplace in lounge whenever any of us would play. All the while, classic legacy tracks, including the ones you've seen throughout the video, were being removed left and right, and a subversive cultural shift was beginning to finally rear its ugly head. It was in the wake of this turn-of-the-decade period, the one that I talk about constantly, that modernistic ideas about what proper track design should supposedly entail were really starting to crystallize in tandem with the notion of the average CT worldwide player having a right to think like a critic when it came to CTs. Council had existed previously, but had mostly remained out of the public consciousness, but its influence became both unavoidable and much more worth keeping track of as they continued to cumulatively eliminate every early 1.03 competitive touchstone as the updates went by. Council's failures during this period, specifically without reference to external factors and evaluated purely on their own accord, is undoubtedly worth a more comprehensive review, but I'm going to put it away for now because I may get back to it in another episode of this subseries, and it's not entirely relevant to this here. What I'd like to zero in on instead is specifically how this fledgling sentiment that everyone can be critical of CT design, which directly precipitated Council's increasingly modernistic/reformist approach to removals, gained traction in tandem with competitive players simultaneously developing the same penchant for design criticism. Modern design sensibilities were, in that sense, like a mimetic virus that neither old-gen nor new-gen players were immune to. Only the players in clans like RN who had sufficiently immunized themselves to prefer skill disparaging tracks were still maintaining the vanguard against this new criticism era. That's not to say that competitive players preferred anything that was added in 2020 or 2021. Those years are rightfully referred to as CTGP's unquestionably worst era, but the attitudes that competitive players were beginning to adopt during that time period was, at least partially, responsible for creating the conditions within which this deconstruction was possible. To put it simply, new tracks weren't in vogue because they sucked balls, not because the prerequisite cultural conditions weren't in place to facilitate appreciation of anything new. Old tracks still comprised the majority of the meta, but it was clear that the circumstances and attitudes that had ushered in the proliferation of difficulty core were on the way out. Only tracks that met the new critical standard were left unchallenged in this period of reevaluation. And what track saw the greatest denunciation in the wake of this transvaluation? Flowery Greenhouse. Saw what, in my experience, was by leaps and bounds the most per capita hatred for an early 1.03 track in the 2020s. The end of difficulty core was met with no grand funeral. First, the player base that had picked their category of tracks ramped down, and just after they had packed their bags and quit, shifting attitudes produced a community-wide disavowal of everything that they had formerly appreciated. And so now that I've spent so long expounding the backstory of how community attitudes got to where they were, we arrive at the beginning of the end. This is a two-pronged story with the events in question leading almost directly to each other. The first part of our tale begins in early 2022. Right around early 2022, whenever Flowery would get picked in lounge, it seemed like something unfortunate would happen. The sentiment for it was already one of general disapproval, to the point of recurrent complaints in chat when it would get picked. People had already complained about the track being buggy, but they had no tangible ground to stand on. That was until multiple people all had really statistically unlikely things happen to them in a short time period. Shortly after a poll was posed to high-tier CT players about banning Melting Magma Melee for a position glitch that occasionally resulted in blue splitting, another one would soon crop up. Posted in the CT high-tier discussion chat alongside an associated yes-no ban poll were 5 GIFs of various players experiencing quote-unquote bugs that all had to do with the opening zipper section on Flowery Greenhouse, which I'll include in an Imgur album in the resources section of the description alongside some annotated notes of all of the Discord arguments that I had with people pertaining to these GIFs. Right off the bat, though, I had an issue with the poll. Of course, I was apprehensive towards this strong possibility of my favorite track being carelessly banned, seeing as it was being left in the hands of people who are all going to naturally be inclined to vote in their own self-interest by preventing themselves from being noob filtered. But I didn't even have to look that far because the poll's very construction presented a problem. Should Aquadrome Stage be unbanned? A previous poll asks. The directly preceding melting poll was phrased in a similarly neutral manner. Ban Melting Magma Melee for position glitches? Or how about this one? Ban Flowery Greenhouse for being incredibly buggy? ? Very deliberate word choice, poll administrator. Sounds like you'd prefer to have this not even be put to a poll. But who is responsible for this biased oversight? The name in question is one that I would say lives on in infamy, but truthfully only really seems to live in obscurity. Their regime was certainly one that people were eager to leave behind. Enter Jackie, an identity that by early 2022 had become synonymous with the stagnant, nepotistic behavior of lounge staff as a whole. A hard-stuck low-tier player on both track types, Jackie's repeated behavior of constantly butting into high-tier matters, attempting to lead the charge in proceedings that should have been out of their reach, seeing as the matters in question were definitely out of their skill range, made them one of the most universally disliked bosses amongst CT players. Therein is your explanation as to how such egregiously opinionated wording managed to make its way into the polling channel, because it didn't have to make it past anyone, it was Jackie through and through. The tail end of this lounge-related segment will make more sense when interpreted with this in mind, but for now I will take a look at the evidence in favor of banning Flowery in itself. Of the 5 substantiating GIFs, 2 of them depicted people failing miserably to drive the track in a human manner. I see no need to pull punches since I initially intended for this to be a full-on rant video. Approaching the zipper at impossibly dumb angles and being deservedly rejected. A time loss that would occur regardless on any zipper in the game. It's the equivalent of complaining because you didn't handle the BCW zippers properly and got sent off the track by the reject road KCL. The one from Kit's perspective is a little more understandable, but even that was still mishandled, even keeping in mind the fact that that is not at all how you would realistically be approaching that segment. The other 2 GIFs did at least have a tenuous sense of merit to them and deserve to be reviewed in more detail, although I hope to explain why neither of them present a substantial enough argument for Flowery to be banned, least of all removed from the pack, the occurrence of which was contributed to by the reputational damage done by this lounge ban. The first of this pair is an instance of zipper lag occurring to multiple people from the perspective of a third party. However, this player was already lagging quite heavily, as can be seen from the sporadic mini-map movements of all the other players, including the ones who aren't zipper glitched. This alone would be enough for me to discredit it, but it does at least indicate an existent issue, and I do not wish to argue against a phenomenon that did in fact occasionally occur, so I will address it. Flowery Greenhouse did have zipper lag because, once again, zipper idiosyncrasies exist ubiquitously in MKW. On Rainbow Road on the RT side, for instance, zipper lag can occasionally cause a player to be displaced for the entire race, resulting in a position tracker bug, or a PTB, which prevents Shock from being pulled in 12th alongside many other unintended scenarios. Now, this is where my own individual experience will simply have to be relied upon. You can choose to trust me or not, but this is my video, and as someone who most likely has one of the highest counts of competitive races played on Flowery out of anyone, I can say that I was only ever impacted by this issue one time. The lag also fixed itself within probably 15 seconds if I recall correctly, and the rest of the race played normally. Seeing as that is the case, I believe this particular zipper lag to be an overblown concern. And so, last but certainly not least, we come to the most salient point, the gif of Frozen clipping off the track while attempting to go for the zipper entry on the right while shocked. This singular clip is the catalyst of hours upon hours of me mentally poring over Flowery as a track over the years, first in trying to come up with counter-arguments to the clip, as I failed to do initially, like you'll see, then eventually to attempting to downplay it, and finally to understanding it and dispelling it. But I was only really able to exhume the physics behind that clip last year because I could finally recreate it. Up until that point, it'll allow me to explain the thought process I was operating with, which I was kind enough to type out. The reason this is a big deal is because when you attempt to go for the zipper entry while small, which is the same strat you do under non-shocked circumstances, you end up landing at right about where the intersection is between the zipper and the pipe. It makes intuitive sense that this would seem like an issue to an engaged observer because spots like these have historically been sketchy in MKW. Most crucially here is the fact that the distance from the pipe to the zipper you go off of to land onto it makes it seem just feasible enough to land atop it while you're shocked, and seeing as you would never approach the pipe head on otherwise since you'd just be getting a high trick and losing time if you weren't shocked, this is the line of reasoning on behalf of Flowery detractors. If you get shocked at this part of the track and attempt to clear the completely understandable gap onto the pipe, what will actually end up happening is that you will hit the corner, clip through the track as a byproduct of MKW physics and die. No longer quoting myself now, and the question as to whether it is possible to land on top I'll return to in a moment. For now, with Frozen's clip in mind, this seemed like the killing blow that these Flowery detractors needed to eliminate it from the playing field once and for all. Because I wanted to touch upon the history of community attitudes towards track difficulty throughout the video, I've mostly neglected to mention the sociological trend of excessive and haphazard track bans that was also in effect around the same time, framing it exclusively as a Jackie thing when it was actually more prevalent than that. As I've said about 1,000 times so far in the series, I'd like to make that its own video, but it is pretty proximal to what is at hand right now, so I will give it the briefest of mentions and state that the state of CT bans had, by now, reached its most over-exaggerated, with perhaps the single most flippant ban-inducing offense being when a momentary position glitch on Old Skyline led to the entire track being banned immediately, despite that having never been a prior issue. Jackie was still, of course, complicit in this ban-happy culture, which creates a predicament. If tracks are banned for such thoughtless reasons, it becomes necessary to essentially defend the honor of any tracks with potentially ban-worthy flaws. Back to the topic at hand, then, since that is precisely what I took it upon myself to do in the immediate wake of the Flowery ban poll being posted. However, in the process of attempting to do this, two very unfortunate developments transpired in rapid succession. Firstly, I made a terrible argument, a laughably god-awful one, and it was certainly laughed at. I was initially arguing with Jackie, who should have been a one-and-done easy Discord argument win, decisively. But then I made the dumbest argument of my career as an aspiring MKW analyst because I wasn't thinking it through and wanted to respond to Jackie's most recent message in the moment, which stated that Frozen had clipped off the track just because he had gone for the normal line while small. And so I, in my infinite wisdom for some reason, compared the zipper entry while shocked that Frozen went for to TF shroomless on regs, which you, of course, cannot make while shocked, but would also see zero reason to ever attempt, thereby making the two things completely incomparable. This is, I hope, the indisputably worst logic you'll ever hear of me using in this series. It's such an insanely stupid line of anti-reasoning that I don't even want to dwell on it any longer, because just having mentioned it threatens to discredit my entire existence, even irrespective of how long ago it was that I said it. One thing that always happens to me in any argument is that the second I make any kind of logic error, I think to myself, man, I really hope nobody latches onto that because it would be very easy to prove me wrong with that in mind. And then before the thought has even fully registered, I've already been called out for the exact oversight I was worrying about. In the moment when whoever from Lightspeed read that message and presumably decided to post it in their chat to criticize, the high-tier discussion channel essentially ceased to be a conversation and turned into my own personal humiliation ritual for having failed to defend the honor of the sentiments behind Difficulty Core. And years later, I still relate Flowery hatred to the response that I was met with. This was the first time that I had really tried to defend my sort of foundational beliefs on CTs in a public venue, only for me to then be instantaneously browbeaten by a clan of RT players who probably didn't even derive the same mechanical enjoyment of the game as I do and just wanted to laugh at the ignorant CT main. Not as if this wasn't just me getting a taste of my own medicine, considering just how often we in RN would do the same thing to other people back then, but at least we did it in ultimate service of skill-based tracks and good players and whatnot. But because I am incredibly egotistical and childish, I returned more than 3 years later to annotate those arguments with a greater awareness so that I don't have to feel like I was disproven so embarrassingly. On the topic of annotations, one important thing that I really need to stress about them, which I should have probably said earlier, is that I do admit that I compose them in a very arrogant Reddit moderator spurgout kind of way, which if any of the participants in the original interaction were to see would perhaps incite them to view it as a personal attack, but I want to make it clear that is not the intention. Think of my critical approach to the annotations as being not an attack on a group of people, but rather an attack on the tangible form of a culture itself as it existed at a point of time in the past. Many authors in academia, for instance, come off very adversarial towards the works that they review, but the overarching goal is always to attempt to aim towards the development of a higher culture in a dialectical sense. My point in posting the argument is to demonstrate by contrast just how much less reductive that serious discussions about MKW are taken today than they were 3 years ago, so that you can appreciate how far we've come. So that's all fine and dandy, but I never did conclude my thoughts on the shocked zipper entry. I'll save you probably 3 hours worth of my mentally comparing it to every single possible shock strat on RTs and say that I could not find any close comparison unless you count the DDR wall glitch turn while shocked, but in that instance it's much more self-evident that you can't do the normal route while shocked than in the scenario on Flowery, which seemingly brings us to an impasse. I was a teensy tiny bit less incorrect in comparing the scenario to TF journalists only because I couldn't think of an accurate comparison to any shock strat from an RT at all. But although I can't connect this to an RT strat to make it easier to understand, I mentioned that I had solved this, so allow me to explain. The presumption that the L members were operating on in 2022 was that recreating Frozen's clip off the track was either a guarantee if you failed to make it onto the pipe, or at least a common occurrence. Here's the kicker: I tried this at home. Using my stuff on MKW SP and an item wheel to give me TCs, I have attempted to recreate this clip dozens of times on both sides of the pipe, and I have not clipped off the track one singular time. It may well be the case that Frozen's odds of having phased off the map were just as unlikely as they would have been on any other zipper clip in the game. If I had to equate it to something, I'd imagine that it's a bit like exiting from the RWS zipper while small, since both instances involve you being parallel with a zipper and getting a wall bonk when you land. It is true that you can very rarely clip off the map on RWS at that spot, even while you're not shocked. So what's the verdict? Well, just 3 months after Flowery was banned in April, it was proven that we didn't even need to attempt to come to one anyways, because even by 2022 standards, and on top of that, even by Jackie standards, it was unbanned in July. And so the lounge band saga comes to an end. 3 months of lost time, but that's nothing in the long term, right? Well, I noticed something after Flowery's unban, and that was radio silence. A complete absence of Flowery picks from lounge events with seemingly nobody but me voting for it at all. It's as if the period that it spent banned had instilled the sense within the high-tier player base that it could never again reclaim its status as a peripheral pick in the meta. This isn't an experience that I would expect to be able to relate to the current player base if not for the fact that we're in the midst of an identical situation as we speak, one that has already gone on for about as long as Flowery's post-unban period did, Cortex Castle. Flowery's closest CTGP Edition relative was one of the first running-based bans on the competitive side, and for many years was even arguably seen as the poster child of running-based bans, but ever since its unban in Lounge 8 months ago, I've only played it twice. Others have echoed this feeling as well. Cortex feels practically extinct because no active players have it in their repertoire since it's subconsciously seen as being out of the picture. The same thing happened to Flowery back then. If not for me picking it, no one would have been. Fast forward 1 year to May of 2023. We shift our focus for this final segment to the CTGP Track Tester server. Over the course of the preceding year, the Track Council first began to experiment with outsourcing the process of removing tracks to the public via Google Forms polls. So, good for the community then, right? Since these polls protect against the abject removals that took out so many difficulty core tracks during the time period when removals were handled entirely by Council themselves. There's just one problem. The method by which tracks are selected to be put onto the polls remains the same as what Council would have removed. I refer to the public polls as protection, but they're really only one additional layer. And the hull was about to crack open to the worst update in CTGP history, because Council's sweeping selection process for this update's removals engendered a poll with a staggering 15 potential candidates, the most out of any poll at that point, of which 4 were slated for removal. By this point, so much reputational damage had been inflicted upon Flowery that Council deemed it a fitting candidate for immediate removal based purely upon supposed design flaws. No minor update, no nothing, straight to the gallows. Of the 15 tracks on the poll, it was one of only 3 to have never been updated prior to its removal. The formerly budding culture of casual FIDE criticism was now at its most pervasive, and this was the moment when its effects attained apotheosis. The poll's result was the apex of casual worship, the damnation of difficulty core, even in all of its downstreamed and more palatable forms. It was a selection of Slot Circuit, Skygrove, Aquania, and my beloved Flowery Greenhouse, topping the poll as the most hated removal candidate of them all. We mourned the death of CTs that day. Much has been said about that update, and I'm sure much more will continue to be said, possibly by me. But above all, I'm disappointed by the lack of respect given to my favorite track because of misconceptions and unwillingness to learn. As unlikely as it may seem, I think there's a world where this is still in the pack. And when I think of everything that transpired, I realize that in the end, I'm still mad about Flowery Greenhouse. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in Season 14 of Lounge.